Is this working? Okay, thank you. So yeah, my name is Alin, and with my colleague Gratian, I will talk about the new buzzword in the React Native now and in React, hooks, and how we became hooked on hooks. That's bad. We have a great mobile community in Softvision, and besides iOS and Android, we also do React Native and cross platforms. So when this came up, we were excited to get it in React Native also, and now we want to share some of our experience with hooks and how we ended up using them. So let's start with the beginning. What's a hook? And then why do we need them, right? Why do we need hooks? Why were they invented? Then we'll go briefly how to use them, and then a real example in using React Native. And then what's next? What do we do from here? So let's start with what is a hook. And we didn't find a clear definition. I don't think there is a clear definition. So I think this is it, right? Now functions can have state in React. How many of you use React or have used React here? Okay, quite a lot. Okay, how many of you heard about hooks? Oh, okay, nice. So that's why you're here. Instead of having a coffee. Okay, so we didn't find a clear definition, as I said, so mostly they are described about what they do. And because we are all developers, engineers, and pretty practical guys, we don't like definitions, so what they do is enough for us. So they let us use the state and other React features without writing a class. So who likes classes in React? Oops. Hey, I know you come from a Java background. It's my colleague there. So yeah, functions seem to be a better mechanism for code reuse. Moving logic between functions is better, it's easier, they are reusable, and more testable. So hooks are basically functions that let you use state and lifecycle for functional components. So you don't need to write classes in order to build React components anymore. I don't know, in our opinion, there should be one consistent way to build React components. Now we have both ways. And functions for us are an obvious choice because you can debug them easier, you can diagnose them easier, you can reuse them, you can compose them, and so on. So now you can use stateful logic also with functions. So in our opinion, that's great. But why hooks? Why do we need them? Some of you, those who raised your hands about the classes, would argue that we were fine before. I mean, there was a clear way to do things. You would use a class when you needed the state, and you would use functional components when you wouldn't need a state, right? Clear separation, one is the state, one is without state. But now, what happens if you need to refactor something or the requirements change and now you don't know if you will need a state in the future or not? What do you choose? So that's a problem. So class components, for those of you that don't use React, allow you to use the states and the lifecycle methods from React. Functional components are pure functions. You can write them in plain vanilla JS, and they don't have access to any state. They just render. They use props and then render something on the screen. So yeah, we were in the good state. So why do we need hooks?
Yeah. So yeah, what's the problem? What's the big problem? We often start with simple components that might look simple for us, and then they grow, and they grow, and we are starting having problems testing them. We are starting having problems actually trying to refactor them, And yeah, we might end up in a spot where we end with complex patterns that a junior or an entry-level developer might not understand or has difficulties reading our code. We understand our code because we wrote it, but the others might not. So what's the biggest issue in using class components? It's state. It's state logic. It's painful to extract and to compose components in such a way that the state might be reused and not duplicated. So yeah, we end up with even components that are wrapped around other components and wrapped around another component. So if we take a simple example of a React application that uses Redux and probably one navigator, then the start component, the app component, it's already wrapped into higher-order components. And that's a thing that creates confusion. So yeah, we end up with something like that.
Yeah, so I come from an Android background. So when I first tried to do a React native app to see if I can try a mobile cross-platform approach, and I saw code for high-order components, I think my jaw dropped. I mean, what is this? So yeah, I think this is a problem for developers that want to switch technologies.
Yeah,
it's a barrier.
Well, yeah, there are multiple issues that we have when actually writing code in React. So, as I said, the application component is a no-brainer. We are starting that as a class component, yeah? Or we used to start that as a class component because we would need some state or lifecycle events. So, yeah, for that one, we were clear. But when we got to smaller components, we know that the best practices say that we should use dumb components, not smart components, as often as possible. So what's a smart component? Smart component is a component that actually holds state and lifecycle events and understands the application. Dumb components are purely presentational. So yeah, going to a path, towards a path where we need to use more dumb components, and that stresses the smart ones. So we end up with different approaches, high-order components and render props, as I said. And you also might end up pushing code that actually might be a functional component. So we had some examples where a class component was pushed and a single line of code, a console log, was entered. Do not remove this, linter will yell or something like that, because yeah, we knew that somewhere in the future we will transform that component into a smart component that also will hold state. So that's a bad practice. So yeah, I'm not really into that. One last thing that I have added there is the confusion, class confusion. So that's a twofold. The first one, it's actually the one that I explained when to use a class component or a function. The other one is actually an issue of object-oriented programs. And I'll say something that Joe Armstrong said. He said that actually the problem with object-oriented languages is that they carry around a lot of things. So a better translation of that, also given by him, was that if you ask for a banana, you will get the gorilla holding the banana and the entire jungle. So this is a clear reference to the constructor and the stopper property method. So how to use hooks?
Yeah, let's start with how we would use to write code before hooks. So let's take a counter example. So you would have the constructor that comes with the component. You would set the state there, and then you would need another method, the setState method, to update the state. Yeah, this is, I think, pretty basic. And then you would have the render function, right? So here you would use handle counter to update, to increment the counter, and to update the state. So for me, this is really confusing not this code, but the keyword this. you have to use it a lot, and in React, that's not really object-oriented. It's not like Java. This can be really confusing. What does this refer to? So how does this code look with hooks?
Yeah. So first of all, I hate slides that are actually on 2 slides. Actually, code
that's on 2 slides.
On 2 slides. Yeah. So mine is on only 1. So yeah, the entire previous 2 slides are actually in this one, and the magic is in that first line, where we use the use state actually. So let's explain it a little bit more. So
that's the hook?
Yeah, that's the hook actually. That's the magic. So use state lets you use local state without actually declaring a class. So you have to use this in a functional component, and it has to be in the top call. So we cannot use a hook inside a conditional or an if or something like that. In this case, the use state hook takes 1 argument and returns an array. By destructuring this array, we can get actually the state and a callback to set that particular state. Okay, so what's this? Actually, this is the equivalent to a lot of things that we had to do in class components. So in constructor, we had to set state, and then when we needed to update, we had to set the state again with the new value. So actually, with this 1 line, we get all those. State, using the use state hook, we can actually use anything to store. This creates a local, independent state. So if I wrote these 3 hooks, they are not going to affect one another. As you can see, I can add anything. The naming of the destructuring can be anything. So I can say banana and get banana, set banana, sorry. But yeah, only one thing, you'll see that all the hooks will use the use prefix. It's not something that, for example, custom hooks need to implement, but the linters will yell a little bit. Yeah. But as I said, the state in a hook can be anything. But working with use state hooks and big objects is not that good. So we should use a hook for every property and set that certain property. And this is because actually the state is replaced every time. So if I, for example, in the last case, set a new cart and I forget the quantity, actually that quantity is lost. Mm-hmm. Okay, so what's a better alternative for using complex objects? Well, use reducer. It's another hook. It's a nice hook. It resembles a lot with things that we are used to if you're used to Redux. So you're using actually a basic reducer and you're feeding the use reducer hook, a reducer that we are used, and an initial state, and that's it. And this will return a state and a dispatch. And this is pretty familiar if you are used to with Redux. So the basic usage of this would be, dispatch and the type of action that I want to do. This is a simple example. It's not something extracted, but this might be more complex objects, and it makes more sense then. Okay, another interesting hook is the useEffect, and this is one of the most powerful ones, actually.
I think useState is pretty powerful.
Yeah.
But yeah, useEffect allows you to perform side effects, like its name tells. So, like API calls, talking with external libraries, subscribing to event listeners and all that, updating the DOM and the UI. So these are all side effects. And we have the useEffects hook to handle all this. So let's take this example. We want to display the count in the document title. And we would do something like this. And if you note, in both methods, we have some duplicated code. So that's that's not really good. So what we could do is use a hook. We have the useState hook from the previous example Gratian showed you, and then we add the useEffect hook that just updates the count in the document title. So this hook combines the functionality, in this example, combines the functionality of component did mount and component did update from the previous slide. They run after the first render and after every update. And I will talk later about how to customize this, because you can customize this. So useEffect happens after render. So React guarantees that the DOM has been updated by the time the effect will run. Also, one important thing is that you have to use useEffect inside the component so that you can use the variable from useState and remain in the same scope. Now, in some cases, you want to apply an effect after every render, but in some cases, applying an effect after every render may create a performance issue, right? In class components previously, before hooks, we could solve this by writing an extra comparison. We would compare the previous state with the new state and see if we need to update. In this example, we pass an extra parameter to the useEffect hook. And what does this mean? So if the count is, let's say, 5, and then our component re-renders with count still 5, because somebody else updated, the React will compare 5 with the previous render 5, and because the items are the same, it will skip the effect. So this is how simple we can optimize this, without any ifs, without any conditions. If you use this optimization, make sure that you include in that array, where I wrote count, every property that can change, and that you need to verify. So props state, the properties that change over time and are used by the effect should be written there so you can optimize your code. You don't render every time. Now, let's say you want to run your effect only once, right? At the beginning. For example, we fetched the list of products from our backend, and when our view came into display, we want to run it only once. Here, what we could do is pass an empty array as a second argument. So here React will compare the next state with empty, and then when you would use the effect only once. So this is the way to use the effect only once. Now it just behaves like component did mount, right? Let's see another customization. We want to display the details of the product when we select an ID. We select something from a list, right? Now, we don't want it to run it only once. We want to run the effect every time when the ID changes. So first thing we could do is remove the argument, right? So this will cause the function to render every time something updates in the view. But that's another problem, because set products will also re-render the view, and you will end up in an infinite cycle. So, of course, logically, we want to send a new request to the backend when our ID changed, not when the products changed. So we do something like this. Here, again, the second argument from useEffects kicks in and helps us, right? Really easy, really simple. So usually, our code looks like this. If we have different features on component did mount, we would add listeners or make requests to our backend or initialize or whatever in our component did mount. So the problem here is that, in our opinion, component did mount will never be closed, right? Every time you need to add something new, you will add it there, right? So it will be an infinite change there. The same is with cleanup and removing listeners. This makes these methods hard to test and hard to debug because they are not encapsulating a business logic. They are encapsulating something that's React related, and that's not really our concern, right? So what you could do with hooks is this. You can use as many side effects as you want. We recommend one for every feature, so we have now a clear separation. And you won't be in a situation where you forgot to remove a listener, for example, because you have to check both methods. So here you have everything side by side. So here all side effects for a feature are grouped in the same method. The useEffects hook lets you return a function. That function that you return, and we will see that in a more complex example further along, will be used by React to clean up anything, to remove listeners and all the cleanup you need to do. So the return function for useEffects is the same as running component will unmount. So let's see how we can build our own custom reusable hook.
Yeah, so Alin showed us an example where he fetched some resources from an API. We can actually pack all that logic together. We actually can add the thing that it's usually linked to fetching resources, is loading. We can set that as a state, and as by using a useEffect, we can actually trigger this fetch whenever we want. In this case, we added the dependencies as a requirement for our custom hook. So whenever we pass the URL and a list of dependencies, we pass that to the useEffect hook, and that will trigger exactly like Alin told us. So basically on the same logic. Using this, it adds more power. So we are actually taking all the duplicated code from our components and use it in a simple hook. Okay, how we can use it? Actually, it's pretty simple. We are destructuring the array that it's returned by the use HTTP. We are getting the isLoading property and the fetch data if we got it. And we are passing actually only the URL and the list of dependencies. So if, in our case, the list of products would depend on something like, I don't know, a checkbox or something like that that needs to be updated, we can pass that as a dependency. Cool. Okay, so we talked a lot about hooks in React. What about React Native? Okay, so I really like the hooks in React Native. So you're covered, first of all. They were added as a support in 0.59, so that's a good thing. But why am I so happy that hooks are in React Native? Well, because in React Native we have a lot of side effects, a lot of working with native components like netinfo, keyboard, orientation, and usually we end up adding a lot of listeners in our components. We might reuse them, but sometimes we might not. And yeah, for example, if we want to see if the application is in offline mode, we kind of have to add some complex patterns like high-order components. So yeah, extracting that in a hook and using that wherever we want, it's great. The other thing that I'm most glad that hooks are here is actually animations. In React Native, we like to add a lot of animations. They are not that performant, so we have to find the middle ground. But the issue is that they are kind of linked to a state or something like a lifecycle event, and they add a lot of code in our components where we kind of pollute them. So instead of looking at a code that should be business or adding logic or enhancing our application, we are actually adding a lot of animation because, as you know, animations are declarative, and yeah, we'll end up to that in 2 slides. But adding animations in a hook actually keeps our code cleaner and drier. So I want to give you an example that happened in our application. We have to support our application both Android and iOS. When working with input data forms, the keyboard will show up, and that creates a lot of hassle in React Native. So there are components that actually try to mitigate this issue, actually, because once you tap an input, the keyboard might overlap that input, and yeah, it's not the best user experience. So we have to make small adjustments, and yeah, there are components, as I said, but we didn't find any component that actually fits the best solution for both iOS and Android. And because we have a really good client, yeah, they want the same look and feel on both of them. So we started adding listeners, keyboard listeners, to make small adjustments in our components. And we ended up with seeing listeners almost everywhere. So yeah, that's a thing that we could extract actually in a hook and add all that logic in a custom hook where we actually subscribe to the keyboard and then remove it. I've copied the code from ReactNative website, and actually they have an example for keyboard adding listeners. So I've only switched that from basic component use to a hook, and that's why you'll see the two arrow functions below to mimic more of what they have. So what I've did here, I'm using a state to actually save the keyboard is on or off, so it's a Boolean. Yeah, in an useEffect hook, I'm listening for those two events, and at the end, I'm returning actually an arrow function. As Alin said, this will be called when the component will unmount, actually. So you can see that because I'm adding the listeners and removing them in the same location, I'm more sure that I won't be missing one line. For example, if did hide listener wasn't removed, I would get to memory leakages. So this is a pretty compact hook that actually saves us a lot of code and of testing code that actually resides in multiple components. So as I said, animations are my favorite part. I like them. They add a lot of great user experience. We like to use them. But yeah, every time I start writing an animation, even though I kind of know and I did some animations and I know the structure, but I have to open the React Native documents again and again because they are, yeah, interesting. They're a declarative way, and they might be lowering the performance of our application because if you're not writing them properly, you might end up hitting the bridge too many times. So yeah, why I've added the low performance, because if you're using hooks and you work hard at one hook, you can then reuse and not bother again. Yeah. And usually animations are repetitive. So in different components that we implemented, we had the same behavior, and we could have extract that, but sometimes they were linked to something specific for that component, and then we ended up reusing almost the same bits of code. Okay, so I will show you our example. So you will see now classic animation. Right. Okay, it's okay. So if you can zoom in.
There you go.
Okay. Okay. So yeah. So our component was actually trying to mimic a ripple effect. So when the user taps the microphone to speak, it will start rippling, and yeah, it created a nice effect. But because of that, we actually added a lot of code. So as you can see, if you can scroll down. Yeah. The start animation actually is doing something, it's doing a delay because we are trying to reuse this component, and somehow this ripple should propagate in at the 500 millisecond intervals. They are trying to, the animation is actually growing, and we are actually changing the scale and opacity. As you can see, we are using the native driver, so with this one we are safe. Yeah. And then in parallel, we are actually scaling it down at the end to restart it. So that's fine, but because it's in a component, we are actually having difficulties testing it. So if you tried to test an animation, you might know what I'm talking. So yeah, that's something that we didn't like. So what we did actually was the animation part. We got it out from a component, and we defined a custom hook with the same principles. Of course, the code looks almost the same, but because it's only wrapped in a useEffect hook, and we are actually that's useEffect hook, and we are actually triggering this once and doing the same logic as before. We are kind of removing that animation part from our component, using it in a hook that if we decide we might not even test it, and we're not going to have a heart attack when we'll see our components with only 70% code coverage. We are now safe because we can test our components, and yeah, the animations can stay in a special place. And that's the usage. We are actually using the circle ripple with 500 milliseconds difference, and those will actually start propagating and making the animation nice. So yeah.
So now we have a clear separation between
yes.
where you define it and where you use it. Yeah.
And at least where we are using it, we can test the entire component. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Play. Good.
So what's next? That's the big question. Well, I've anticipated some of your questions, and then I'll try to respond to these and the ones that you have. So, do I have to use hooks? No, you're not. So it's the final releases of both React.js and ReactNative are backwards compatible. So you're not obligated to use hooks. There is no timeline to switch from components to hooks. You can use both. My recommendation for you is to try them, see the power of hooks, and yeah, if you like them, you can actually convert an entire application from class components to functional components using hooks. Another question is, am I covered by switching from React component to functional components, or let's say it some other way? Are all the lifecycle events available using hooks? The answer to this question is actually no, but I have a question for you. Who uses component did catch? Okay, 1, 2, okay, 3. Okay, get snapshot before update.
What's that?
Okay, 1, nice. So these two life cycles are not covered. React team says that they will cover them, but for the moment they are not. But as you see, it's only few examples. I'm not really sure when you used it, so we can talk after. Okay. So yeah, you're basically covered. What's the performance? That was actually my first question when I saw hooks. I did some research, and it seems that there are some benchmarks that are testing hooks versus high-order components, and hooks lost, but not by much. So yeah, they are not as performant as high-order components, but they're still there. So tests. Yeah, this is a mixed feeling. When I saw the hooks, that there were functions, I said, yeah, I can test them as a simple function. But then I thought, okay, but you have to import React, and that adds a lot of stuff, actually. So the hooks, the function hooks are actually special functions. They cannot be tested as simple functions. So some fiddling needs to be done, but they can be tested. And the best thing, as I said before, is that by extracting something, and not reusing that part in 10 places. You are actually testing one thing in one place, and that's it. And if you think about it, state components were hard to test before also. So yeah, that's not the best, the worst trade-off. So that's a good thing. This is it. Do you have any questions?
There's one last slide.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Thanks. So thank you.
So you have any questions? I have a mic here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. So I've actually talked about this with a couple of people, and we were asking ourselves if hooks completely replace class components, right? Mm-hmm. So you already said there's two life cycles which are not covered, which people rarely use, but there are use cases. Let's leave those aside, right?
Yeah.
Do you still see other use cases for using class components where hooks just don't do the job?
Well, it depends. So if you are making the switch now, it's hard to fill all the gaps. So for example, in our case, we are actually using Redux. So we are kind of waiting for an alpha build now in Redux to come out with hooks. But yeah, so for a period of time, we'll still be using class components, and probably in the future we might switch to functional components only because we have a lot of gain out of this. And yeah, why not test it in a small project and see the performance and see the issues and then go from there and decide.
Yeah, for me, I think more and more languages go towards functional programming.
Yeah.
So that's I see a trend there. Even Java now with the new APIs went to more functional programming. So yeah, I think the future for React, I think it will be using more functions than classes.
Yeah. Thanks.
There.
Hello, I have a question regarding performance.
Yeah.
In all your examples, you are using anonymous callbacks for callback handlers for components. Mm-hmm. Will that affect performance compared to class components where you can use class-bound methods? Meaning that each render of your parent component will actually force the child component to re-render because you will give a new instance of that function.
Yeah, well, we try to keep our examples as minimal and simple as possible. But yeah, I haven't tested.
Can you avoid that using something that will not trigger the re-render of your child components?
Not sure I understand exactly.
So let's say you have your parent component that has the state, and you want to increment the state using a callback from a child component. Using the class method, the class component, you can have a class-bound method, meaning that the method will be the same for that component, no matter how many times the render method will be called. But in this case, how can you avoid passing a new function every time the component renders? Does it make sense?
Yeah, it does. So I'm not really sure. Probably you can use memo. There's a hook.
Yeah, but how can you access the state in that callback?
Not sure.
Okay, that was a question.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Okay.
So it's an open question if you have the answer. Okay, so if you have one more question, I will pass the mic. If not, so from now on, the conference will continue on 2 tracks. This will be one track, and another track will be at the other floor. We will have a short break for networking and coffee, and then we will continue with Natalia and Dimitri. Please give a round of applause for these 2 guys. Thank you.